To officially start this webinar, I would like just to invite Professor Dr. Tetsushi Sonobe to give the opening remark. Professor Dr. Tetsushi Sonobe is the Dean and the CEO of the Asian Development Bank Institute, the Tokyo-based think tank of the Asian Development Bank. He is also the Vice President of the Japanese Association for Development Economics. Before joining ADBI in 2020, he was the Vice President of the National Graduate Institute for Policy Study, or the GRIPS, in Tokyo, and a professor of the economics at the GRIPS Tokyo Metropolitan University and the Foundation for Advanced Study on International Development. Professor Tetsushi Sonobe, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Picha, for kind introduction. Good day from Tokyo. Welcome to Think20 associated webinar on Rethinking Social Protection Reform in Post-Pandemic Recovery. As the Dean of ADBI, I'd like to express my gratitude to the co-chairs of T20, Professor Bambam Brojonevoro and Professor Disma Simanjuntak, and the lead co-chair of Task Force 5, Dr. Asep Sirehadi, for allowing ADBI to support this side event as co-organizer collaborating with SMERU. As a co-chair of Task Force 5, I'm honored to provide some opening remarks today. A comprehensive and inclusive social protection system is an effective tool for reducing poverty, protecting vulnerable groups, increasing resilience to economic and health shocks, and achieving human rights such as education and health. It's essential for untroubled living conditions. Since the outbreak of COVID-19 more than 2 years ago, we have observed that comprehensive mechanism of social safety nets, together with inclusive social policies, has been the key to addressing underlying challenges of poverty and exclusion. It's obvious that we need social protection, but for it to be effective, it must be nicely designed and implemented in accordance with economic, social, cultural conditions of each country, including the constraint of limited fiscal space in times of crisis like this. We believe that continuous learning and the sharing of experiences will help policymakers, government officials, and civil society design an effective social protection system and implement it efficiently. The webinar aims to develop the list of policy recommendations on social protection reforms and viable solutions to reducing inequalities and building global resilience in the post-pandemic recovery growth. I'm delighted that this webinar has truly excellent and distinguished speakers and panelists who can help the participants. I'd like to express my sincere gratitude to them for taking the time to join us today to share their insights.
Our next speaker, we have an honor to welcome Dr. Vivi Uraswati for the special talk on the social protection reform for inclusive and sustainable development with a complementation of Indonesia experience. Allow me just to briefly introduce her. Dr. Vivi is a senior advisor to the Minister of National Development Planning for Social Affairs and Poverty Reduction. Her main responsibility is to do analysis and advise the minister on social and poverty reduction related issues and strategies. She also leads the National Secretariat for Sustainable Development Goal. And she has long experience in designing major poverty reduction programs in Indonesia, including conditional cash transfer and subsidy. So Dr. Vivi, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Pachaya. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, good evening, and maybe good morning. Allow me to share. I hope everybody can see it clearly. As you may see here, at the left-hand side graph shows that the vulnerability in global context has increased. Along the line, there are a number of disasters as well as people affected that are increased over the years. Later, we also experiencing on the climate change that has pushed around more than 100 million people to become extreme poor. And some estimations by 2030, it's still increased. And then around 20 people in every minute have become refugee, and more than 64 million people in the world need to be evacuated. And as we experience for the last 2 years, COVID-19 has infected many households and people. More than 500 million people around the world has been infected, and 6.2 million of them were died. And the virus has more than 50 mutations now that challenge the existing vaccine that we have so far. So risks in the future may come up bigger and make an impact for the loss on livelihood as well as the well-being degradations. Ladies and gentlemen, here more risks that we experience in Indonesia because climate change. There was an increase in temperature, rainfall, as well as the sea level, which imply bigger risk for fishermen, because around 5.8 million kilometers of Indonesian oceans now dangerous for ships less than 10 GT. And then people live in the seashore more vulnerable because the higher sea level, and it has damaged also the rice productions in some areas. If we see the growth incident curve over the years during the pandemic, we see that all people have been impacted, not only at the national, but also at the urban and rural. Urban, and particularly the middle class, has been impacted most. And if we see the right-hand side table, there is some shift on labor composition from the tertiary or services sectors to more primary sector. We could learn that this is because the primary sector has more relatively less contact intensive and informal, so people can easy and adapt in the time of a lockdown. These tell us that we need structural transformations, in particularly for the primary sector, because so far it has a low value added and shorter supply chain, particularly for Indonesia. So we are all in the same storm, but we are not all in the same boat. There are some vulnerability because high informality, insufficient coverage on the social safety net, as well as in the social security. Some live on the fragile environment, climate change and disasters regions, and there are some problem in the increasing inequality due to the still excluded financially, as well as on digital. So there are some challenges in terms of a new poor and new vulnerability. We agree that vaccine is now become a game changer. And indeed, the Indonesian government put a lot of effort to have or to push a massive COVID-19. We could see from the graph here that since the vaccine has been rolled out, the cases and also the death have slowed down. And now we could open the economy gradually. The government commitment now for booster hopefully will help to mitigate the impact for a new variant of the COVID, and also the possibility of other wave of cases, which is all of us don't want to have it again. First, we have to build the community resilience. Building community resilience, not only from in terms of capital, labor, but now the technology become a backbone. as well as the human capital to expand the resilience as soon as possible, or in more agile process. We have law on the village, which provide a basis for community empowerment, as well as on the social registry that now going on to started to expand beyond the poor as well as the vulnerable in terms of the database. And then the government have enacted a lot of government regulations for disability inclusions. Now around 21 out of 34 provinces and 66 districts and also 27 cities have enacted regional regulations on disability inclusion, as well as more associations, including mayors, to also develop inclusive cities. Again, the digital transformation is the key to make sure that the development in the future more inclusive and also sustainable. So we urge the adaptive social protections that Stefano has already explained. The idea is how that the current design of the policies that more silo in the beginning move toward more orchestrated in terms of the concept as well as the program and activities. So we are now having a lot of discussion how to integrate the roadmap for the social protections that along the line need to be aligned with the disaster risk reductions roadmap and the climate change adaptation. That would be a base to create a longer term or transformative of the current programs as well as other instruments. The building block to create an adaptive social protections, the database, the data information is the key. And then designing the program to make it more agile and adaptive into any chance of crisis. And then bring an institutional arrangement as well as the coordination mechanism and the partnership, including also for the costing. There are 6 strategies that government provide or develop to build forward better. SDGs as the main instrument, not only for 2030, but also to achieve Indonesia's as an advanced country by 2045. The 6th strategy, including the 3 game changer, like the green economy, which consists of the low carbon economy, blue economy, and energy transitions, digital transformation that I mentioned earlier, as well as domestic economic integrations. One more strategy is the new capital city as a new source of economic growth in order to balance the economy between the regions, particularly in eastern part of Indonesia. That's all that I can share. I hope all of these slides could be a reference for a fruitful discussion later. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ibu Vivi. It's very comprehensive and it's very informative to know about the Indonesia economic strategy that in line with the SDG goals. Please stay with us for a little while because we will have Q&A session later. And then I also like to encourage the audience, if you have any question to either Dr. Scarpetti or Ibu Vivi, just please put it in the Q&A box. So let me just move to our next speaker, which is we have an honor to welcome Mrs. Tomoko Hayashi. She is the Director General of the Gender Equality Bureau, Cabinet Office of Japan. She holds a master's degree in economics from London School of Economic and Political Science and graduated from the University of Tokyo. So as I mentioned, she's a DG of this Gender Equality Bureau in the Cabinet Office. So she reports to the Prime Minister and the Minister of Gender Equality as the head of National Missionary for Promoting Gender Equality in Japan. She was a Director General for the Economic and Fiscal Affairs until August 2020, serving as the Vice Chair of the OECD Economic Policy Committee and supporting the Prime Minister at the G7 and G20 summit meetings as the Chief Representative of the Cabinet Office. So today I would like us to hear from you, DG Hayashi, about how do we enhance the gender equality as well as build up the social safety net, particularly if we can learn from Japanese experience. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good day. It's a great honor and a privilege to speak to you at this event. I'd like to talk about the social safety net in the post-pandemic recovery, including the current status and issues of gender equality in Japan and the policy measures of the government. So I'd like to share the slides. Let's see. Okay. Okay, so I'll begin with the impact of the COVID-19 impact on women in Japan and the challenges brought to the fore by the pandemic. Women have been disproportionately affected, resulting in an increase in female suicides due to the economic difficulties and domestic violence. Cases of spousal violence increased by 1.6 times over the previous year, while the number of cases of support centers for victims of sexual crimes and sexual violence increased by 1.2 times, while the number of suicides among men dropped slightly over the previous year, the number of suicides among women has increased significantly, which is a great shock to the government and the Japanese society. We have observed signs of a recession, particularly in the early stages of the pandemic. The industry most affected by the pandemic has been the hospitality industry, including restaurants and hotels. In the accommodations, food and beverage services, we see a great decrease in female employees here. This is because more than 60% of employees in this industry are women, many of them in non-regular employment, and many of them have lost their jobs. On the other hand, the number of employees has increased in the fields of medicine, healthcare and welfare, and information and communications, ICT industries. To be more specific, there are differences between the impact on men and women. There has been a greater increase in the number of male employees in the information and communications industries, and a greater increase in the number of females in the medical and healthcare fields. For women's economic empowerment, it is important to create an opportunity for women's employment in the digital industry while considering the impact of COVID-19 and economic and industrial structural changes that have come with digitalization. We are now planning to support women to improve their digital skills, to provide trainings of digital skills for women, and to promote women's re-employment and career change in the digital industry by offering a subsidy to local governments as a kind of active labor market policy. In this pandemic, some women have fallen into poverty because of the dual labor market in Japan. Around 80% of male workers are regular employees. In Japan, by contrast, more than half of women employees are in non-regular employment. There are also wage gaps between men and women and between types of employment. When we look at the situation by employment type, there is a pay gap between regular employees with a higher percentage of men and non-regular employees with a higher percentage of women. There is also a pay gap between regular men and women employees. The older the employees get, the wider the gaps become. Pay gaps are the widest in the age range of 55 to 59. Moreover, men and women in the same occupation and with the same length of service and receiving different salaries. Not only in the information and communication fields, where the percentage of women is low, but also in the childcare industry, where the percentage of women is high. Male salaries are higher for the same years of service, and the pay gap becomes widest in the 10th and 14th years of service. The government introduced the principle of equal pay for equal work into the law and enforced it in April 2020, but there's still a long way to go before the dual labor market is eliminated. Although the gender pay gap in Japan has been narrowing in the long term, it lags significantly behind that of other countries. From the perspective of women's economic empowerment, eliminating the gender pay gap is an urgent task. We will review corporate disclosure rules to fix the gender pay gap. In Japan, there is another big challenge, which is aging. As Japan approaches the era of 100-year life, half of Japanese women live to be 90 years old, and there are 69,000 women who are over 100 years old. On the other hand, the number of divorces has increased, and it reached 1/3 the number of marriages. The traditional family image of the 20th century, where the man works and the woman takes care of the home, is no longer the norm, and women's lives and the structure of families have diversified. Many elderlies and single mothers experience poverty. More than 50% of single mothers suffer from poverty, and this score is extremely high in the OECD countries. A rapid response is necessary, and we believe women's economic empowerment is the key to responding to the challenges that Japan's women are facing and structural issues. Prime Minister Kishida has placed these issues at the core of a new form of capitalism, the showcase policy of the Kishida administration. It is also necessary to review the social security system to enhance women's economic empowerment. We'll review the social security system comprehensively, including healthcare, elderly care, pension, and countermeasures to the falling birth rate. While the pandemic of COVID-19 has revealed the weaknesses of every country, we have found that Japan's weakness is digitalization and gender equality. Therefore, gender equality is an important and solid policy for the government of Japan. We are committed to strive for fundamental reforms that go well beyond our past efforts. We look forward to working with all of you for women's economic empowerment and gender equality. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, DG Hayashi, for your comprehensive presentation. So I think we have roughly about 10 minutes for the Q&A. Comprehensive social protection framework for the post-pandemic recovery. We have an honor just to welcome Dr. Ilan Sastri Satriawan, just to be the moderator of this session. He is the chief of the policy working group, the national team for the acceleration of the poverty reduction in Indonesia, as well as he also the co-chair of the T20 Task Force 25 of for this year under the Indonesia's presidency. So with no further ado, I give the floor to Pak Ilan. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bichaya. I hope you can hear me well.
Perfectly well, thank you, Pak.
Okay, thank you again. So I think we all agree that this pandemic is unprecedented shock that caused multidimensional crisis. And we know that the cost was huge on the various sectors, leaving the world with sharp increase in poverty, including the extreme ones, and also new forms of vulnerabilities. Although we now seeing that the world is recovering, but the works to heal the world remain far from the end. What we saw and experienced during the pandemic is how social protection system in many countries do not yet sufficiently provide protection for those adversely affected by the pandemics. And this call for more comprehensive and more inclusive social protection systems. In this session, we have 5 speakers to discuss the topic, and based on their insight, the speakers will identify important and necessary measures that must be taken into account for comprehensive reforms in social protection system and policy solutions that address the key challenges faced by developed and developing countries. So let me now introduce our 5 speakers for this session. First, we have Paula Subagci, who is professor and chair advisory board at the Global Policy Institute at Queen Mary University of London. Second is Amir Hamza Jilani, who is social sector specialist, human and social development division in South Asia Regional Department of Asian Development Bank. Third is John Pigot, who is a Scientia Professor of Economics and also Director of Australian Research Council Center of Excellence in Population Aging Research in the University of New South Wales. Fourth is Sudarno Sumarto, who is Senior Research Fellow and Policy Advisors at the SMERU Research Institute and the National Team for the Acceleration of Poverty Reduction. Last but not least, we have Tai Suk Lee, who is a head of unit of policy response to demographic changes in Korea Development Institute. Each speaker will share their insight for maximum 7 minutes. And after that, we're going to have a discussion session. I will pick the question from the Q&A panel. So please write down your question there. Make sure it's concise, and perhaps you need also to direct the question to which speakers. So for the first opportunity, I'd like to give the podium for the Paula Subagci. Please, Paula.
Thank you very much, Ilan, and welcome and hello to everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I know there is a group of people across various time zones. I will have my presentation and comments today will focus on the social security, but also the fiscal policy, which is an area, and macroeconomic is my area of knowledge. So I will start with showing this slide, which actually summarizes the impact of COVID. I must say, and it is important to stress that in this session we discussed the post-COVID recovery. In reality, and I believe after this seminar was organized, we got into another crisis, which is the result of the war in Ukraine, which obviously will have a different impact on different countries. And again, depending on the proximity to the warfare, but also depending on the trade links with countries that are directly impacted by this war. So there will be more displacement and further shock. You probably are aware that yesterday the IMF has downgraded its economic forecast, and obviously this will have an impact on everybody, and in particularly the poorest. So if we look at the impact on COVID of this in this table, you can see a number of indicators. So the one which actually comes very clear is food security. And so you can see that as a result of COVID, more people, and in fact, roughly doubled the number of people who were experiencing food insecurity before COVID. This number has increased, and actually we expect even more people being affected by food insecurity as a result of the current crisis, because again, the export of grains and food from the countries at war will impact on particularly developing and low-income countries. COVID obviously didn't have a big impact on migrants and refugees for obvious reasons. We expect then the current crisis will increase these numbers. And obviously, COVID has an impact on economic output, on trade, and general government balances. And again, we heard from Stefano Scarpetta the dimension of fiscal policy that is important to create resilient and inclusive social security systems. One thing we know then that COVID has an impact on the labor market and on people with protections that are linked to their employment status. So again, healthcare in many systems, in many countries, and benefits and social benefits in, again, many other countries. So in other words, there will be, the COVID show very clearly the dividing line between those in employment and those in casual work, and the dividing line between those able to provide, knowledge work that could provide it from home, so smart working, and those who need actually to turn up, so manual workers who needed to deliver they work by turning up physically at the workplace. So that was again a big divided, and so what I think is important to stress is a shock like the pandemic. But I would say also the current shock we are experiencing shows that we had social systems were not resilient, even in countries that spend a significant percentage and a significant share of their budget in supporting for supporting a social security system. So again, what it was lacking was the resilience, so the ability to respond effectively to crises and to shocks, and obviously the inclusiveness. So obviously what we have now is then the COVID has increased inequality between countries, among countries, because obviously, again, the response to depended very much on the type of the economy and the level of development, but also within countries. So again, in rich economies, we actually experience a big divide between those who are in jobs that can provide and protect them and continue to provide livelihood during a shock like the pandemic, and those who are not in this situation. So what do we do next? And what do we do in particular, knowing that we are facing, and this crisis then at the very least will have an impact on the global output. So the thing is, the burden and the focus is on fiscal policies. And fiscal policies are the response, and fiscal policies are not only the response in terms of short-term shocks or the immediate response to shocks, but also is a good way to plan for the long term. And what we need here to create resilience, as we heard from Stefano Scarpetta, are systems that are built for the long term. So in other words, another lesson we learned from COVID is that if we don't have this system in place, we cannot create it overnight and be effective. Overnight we can give a short-term response to crisis, which means as we did, provide support to those who cannot look after themselves properly. But the thing is, that doesn't mean we have a resilient system. So we need to think in terms how we do have fiscal policy, how we can have fiscal space that allows us to invest in this social infrastructure, which is very, very important. This is an important topic for the G20 as it is for the G7, in particular at this juncture where we are going to experience slow economic growth, we're going to experience high inflation. This again, cost of living is another important topic that will affect the poorest, and again the response through social system and through the welfare safety net is very important. But so how do we respond to this? Again, the thing is, and I will conclude here, the shock of COVID has narrowed and the fiscal space of many countries, in particularly low-income countries. The G20 have already responded to this crisis, to that crisis, with a number of arrangements like the DSSI or the Common Framework. More needs to be done, and in particular, more need to be done to, I would say, technically to estimate and measure the fiscal space of many countries in a dynamic way, in order to find a way to allocate future investment for future resilience. And again, social infrastructure, but also investment in climate action and environmental sustainability. So there are a number of proposals. I don't think I have the time to deal with them right now, because I think my time is over. But basically, the thing is, my message is, we cannot talk about resilient and inclusive social system, social security system, without inevitably answer the question, how are we going to pay for them? And innovative financing and a new approach to fiscal policies is what is necessary here in order to respond to future shock and current shocks. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Paula. Okay, I think now I'd like to give the opportunity to Amir. Please, Amir, your 7 minutes start now.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Pakilan. I'll just wait for my slides to be projected. Yeah, we can move to the first slide. Okay, thank you so much again for this opportunity to discuss reform opportunities in social protection in the region. Before I get to that, let me just provide some context of why social protection is so important. So this slide provides a snapshot of the socioeconomic impact of the pandemic in Southeast Asia, which is the region that I concentrate on. So after growing by about 4.4% in 2019, the region's output contracted by about 4% in 2020. Now, the decline in output, of course, varied across countries in the region, with some more severely affected than others. But this decrease in output was accompanied by an increase in poverty. Extreme poverty rose by 5.4 million in Southeast Asia in 2020, primarily due to the severe decline in economic activity. And in 2021, another 4.7 million people fell below the extreme poverty threshold compared to the 2020 no COVID-19 baseline scenario. The pandemic also resulted in a severe labor market disruption. The ILO estimates that in 2020, employment in the region was 10.6 million less than the no pandemic scenario. And of course, the employment losses were particularly severe for women, youth, and MSME workers. And it's quite likely that these poverty and employment impacts that we see will persist for some time, particularly as inactive workers become de-skilled and access to economic opportunities further deteriorates. Next slide. So this slide just zooms into the disproportionate employment impacts that we see on youth in Southeast Asia. As you can see, the youth's share in job losses is higher than their share in employment across most heavily affected sectors, including wholesale and retail trade, manufacturing, real estate, business and administrative activities, and accommodation and food services. Next slide. So social protection clearly acted as a critical pillar of support in Southeast Asia during COVID-19. Between March 2020 and May 2021, Southeast Asian economies planned or put in place 146 social protection measures, with social assistance accounting for over 70% of the social protection response in the region. Nearly 50% of social assistance came in the form of conditional or unconditional cash transfers, but we also saw food and in-kind transfers. Many countries also introduced new social insurance measures, including paid sick support and unemployment benefits, as well as labor market programs such as wage subsidies and job activation measures. To give you just one example of the impact of these measures, in Cambodia, the government launched a COVID-19 emergency cash transfer program for poor and vulnerable households, identified through an on-demand registration process and targeting database known as ID Poor. And as of October 2021, 95% of eligible ID Poor households, roughly 19% of all households in the country, had received support through the program. Simulations now demonstrate that without the transfer, 17.3% of Cambodian households would have been pushed below the international poverty line of $1.90 a day. And in fact, transfers may even have lifted up to 164,000 households out of income poverty compared to the pre-pandemic baseline. So clearly, these transfers can be an extremely important source for preserving economic well-being, particularly during a shock. But we have more growing evidence that suggests that transfers also have helped avoid a spike in COVID-19 cases and related deaths. Next slide. Now, of course, there are still many challenges facing social protection systems in Cambodia. I think we know what most of them are. But for Southeast Asia, expenditure and coverage levels not only lag behind most other regions of the world, but also within the Asia-Pacific region. The percentage of the population covered by at least one social protection benefit in Southeast Asia stands at just 33%, compared to 46% for the Asia-Pacific region more widely, when you include the People's Republic of China. Similarly, spending also lags behind other regions, with countries investing on average 2.7% of their GDP on social protection. There's of course significant variation across countries, but there's still lags in terms of spending and coverage. And then of course there are issues of fragmentation and underdeveloped systems. And in some countries, there have been historically numerous small schemes with incoherent mandates, contradictory approaches, and poor coordination. So building coherent and integrated systems will be critical moving forward. Next slide. So this slide just highlights that even with existing spending levels and coverage rates, certain groups remain particularly vulnerable, including children, women, informal workers, older persons, and persons with disabilities. As an example, less than 1 in 5 children in Asia and the Pacific receive child or family benefits. We also know that there's a very high share of informal employment, and most informal sector workers are not covered by any form of adequate social protection. And of course, women were particularly vulnerable even prior to the pandemic, but experienced disproportionate adverse impacts during the crisis. Informality, unpaid care work, and gender-based violence are just some of the growing risks that women in the region continue to face. Next slide. So this is my last slide. So despite the challenges we see and know about in social protection, I think there are some key reform opportunities to strengthen social protection systems and expand coverage. The pandemic has increased demand for and interest in adaptive and shock responsive social protection systems, with many countries now developing a roadmap for what this would look like. But we know that it requires the ability to respond quickly during a crisis. So dynamic and on-demand registries will become increasingly important. Linkages with disaster risk management and early warning systems can actually help deliver vital support to vulnerable populations even before a disaster strikes. And investments in capacity will become important to facilitate pre-registration and rapid enrollment and to also ensure that systems don't get overburdened by caseloads. Somewhat related, there's also growing demand to strengthen and better integrate social protection delivery systems, including ID systems, identification and targeting systems, including social protection registries, the MIS and digital information systems. And in fact, the importance of advancing digital technology solutions across the delivery chain and using technology to streamline business processes is a key lesson that I think we've all taken away from the pandemic to make systems much more efficient and effective. Given the wide-ranging and wide-reaching impacts of the pandemic and the critical role that social protection has played to safeguard incomes and livelihoods, we may see some appetite within the broader government machinery to consider reforms for sustainable financing of social protection to increase expenditure and coverage levels. The large fiscal outlays and transfer programs that we saw at the start of the pandemic are now gradually tapering off, but it is important to ensure that support is not withdrawn abruptly, and more importantly, to consider the necessary reforms required to expand coverage across the life cycle. Now, of course, domestic resource constraints may restrict transformational changes overnight, but I do think opportunities exist to strengthen systems gradually and support inclusion, improve monitoring and evaluation, and explore innovative solutions such as the graduation approach or what are known as economic inclusion programs. ADB pilot tested this in the Philippines and found very promising evidence. And also other employment generating and empowerment programs such as Indonesia's Kartu Prakerja program. This is a very promising example of how temporary social assistance can be better linked with skills development and job facilitation to support job seekers and vulnerable workers and those in the informal economy gain the skills needed to access higher wages or sustain their businesses in the digital economy. So programs like this highlight the promise of social protection, not just as an instrument for building resilience in the face of shocks, but also as a vital tool to promote economic recovery, financial inclusion, and quality jobs in a rapidly changing world. Thank you.
Thank you, Amir. Next speaker is John Picot. Please, John, your turn.
Thank you very much. I'd like to begin by saying it's a great privilege and pleasure to be addressing this group and to be a part of this webinar. I think the topic that is being addressed is of fundamental importance and will have long-term implications. I didn't think I was able to start my video, but maybe I now can. Can everyone see me? Next slide, please. So I thought I'd just divide my talk into two pieces. One around how things have changed as a result of COVID, and the other around what those changes might mean for changing social protection. And I was particularly asked to focus on retirement incomes, and so that's where most of these comments will have specific reference, but some of them will be more general, will be around health, will be around the volatility in the labor force, which other speakers have already highlighted. If you think about changes in retirement assets, many countries used retirement assets, early access to retirement assets, as a way of funding people who had lost wages, either because of stand downs or because of longer term unemployment. And as a result of that, there's less now to build upon as people approach their retirement. And if we think about it nationally, right, or nation by nation, most countries have gone much further into debt than they ever believed would be possible 3 years ago. And so that means that there's going to be a tightening of constraints on developing or improving social pensions. And so on the one hand, you have a situation where people are going to be more reliant on some form of basic pension or social pension, which will underpin some form of minimum income support in the absence of adequate pre-funded or adequate pay-as-you-go pensions that are employment related. On the other hand, there's going to be less capacity to do that. And then the second thing that I think has changed a lot is the profile of risks. So relative to 3 years ago, I think the equity premium is higher. Global risk perceptions of global risk are higher. People are now aware that events such as the pandemic can occur. Financial institutions are aware of this. And as a result, there's much more nervousness. And that has come at the same time as a historically low floor on interest rates, which really started with the global financial crisis, but which has been, of course, exacerbated by the pandemic. And so that has another kind of implication, and that is that annuity valuation becomes very difficult. So if you're thinking about trying to convert a capital sum into an income, these very low interest rates make that not a very attractive proposition. And then, because of those low interest rates, house prices are rising. Now, whether that will last, whether that is a further risk that some people are exposing themselves to, I'm not sure. What it does mean, it seems to me, is that if those prices are sustained, or even if some proportion of those prices are sustained, there is going to be a transmission of inequality to the next generation. So there'll be more wealth for some people, but it's going to mean more difficulty in younger people getting into the housing market. And so in the next generation, there are going to be the haves and the have-nots, and that's going to be more extreme than we have observed in the past. How much more extreme remains to be seen. It may be maybe something that is receiving too much attention, maybe overemphasized, but I think in some degree that will be there. And then finally, there is increased inflation risk. Inflation is increasing, certainly in the US, I think globally, and it's an implication really of the quantity theory of money, but it's exacerbated by issues such as the slowdown in China, the slowdown in manufactured exports from China, and other associated phenomena which have been occurring over the past 3 years and which are pandemic related. And so that's how I see it. On the one hand, you have this kind of reduction in overall assets, either personal or national, then or potential assets. And then on the other hand, you have changes in the profile of risks, which to meet, you really require more assets. So the next slide, please. So the first point I would make, I think, is that this means that basic pensions are more important than ever, both now and into the future. Various speakers before me have pointed out that there has been disruption in labor markets, which have led many people to losing their jobs, many people being pushed into lower paid jobs, many people confronting sustained unemployment. And that means that pay-as-you-go systems of retirement income, which are labor related, be they pay-go or pre-funded, are going to confront, are going to be lower for some people. There's going to be a greater disparity there. And that means that basic or social pensions, whatever phrase you want to use, become more important than ever. And I think broader coverage, I think this previous speaker emphasized this, that you could use digital ID and so forth, so that broader coverage becomes more important than ever. And now there is the possibility of doing that through advanced IT and digital identification. But the benefit level will need to be increased as well, because even the value of contributory pensions, where they continue to be available to people, those values are likely to fall. And there's going to be, I think, an increased need for social protection. So if you think of social pensions, you really need to index these and index them probably to community standards, and index both the value of the first benefit that you get when you reach your eligibility age, and then throughout the payout period as well. So you have immunization against that inflation risk, which might be considerable, it might be short-term. One of the aspects of risk is that you don't really know, you can't say with certainty what the outcomes will be, what that trajectory will be. And then if you turn to contributory pensions, I think it's very important that people understand that reduced retirement accumulation and reduced benefits are likely to follow for at least some parts of the population following upon the pandemic and its financial rollouts. People need to understand that. And it's not clear to me that they all do. In fact, the Australian experience, I know this is a developed country, is that many people, when they were given the opportunity for early drawdown, just took everything they could, and many accounts were completely emptied out. So it tended to be the poorer group in the population which took advantage of those initiatives in that way. And they're exactly the group that are going to be most reliant on social pensions into the future. I think it's quite important to facilitate working longer. This is done probably less well than it should be in most countries. There is some evidence that people are content to do this, actually would like to do this, perhaps work longer but make less of an effort as they age. So perhaps there's less responsibility in the work that they do, maybe less intensive work, but nevertheless work for a few more years. And that, of course, helps a lot in facilitating and financing and supporting retirement income when the time comes that you withdraw from the labor market altogether and your earnings capacity is exhausted. And I think you've also got to worry about what happens to the next generation. We can see this enormous explosion of debt, which will have to be addressed at some stage into the future. And so more emphasis, I think, on prepaid pensions would go some way to reducing that debt burden on future generations. So I see those as the kinds of changes in the pension and retirement income space, which might be a recipe, not a recipe exactly, that's the wrong word, but be a way forward in recasting social protection policy in the retirement income space. And I think you should never waste a good crisis. And I think the opportunity to expand social pensions in this context, to the extent that it can be afforded, should be grasped fully. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. So before we move to the next speaker, so I'd like to invite the audience actually to write down your question. You can put your question, write down your question in Q&A panel. Start now. So now we move to the next speaker, who is Sudarno Sumarto. Please, Mas Sudarno.
Thank you, Bailan. Good evening, good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank the ATPI and the SMERU Research Institute for kindly inviting me to this webinar. And I would like to use my 7 minutes to talk about 3 things. First, briefly, how COVID-19 has impacted the life of Indonesian citizens and poverty. Second, how the government of Indonesia responded to mitigate the pandemic impacts, and what have we learned from our experiences. And finally, what needs to be done to improve Indonesia's social protection system beyond COVID-19. Next, please. Indeed, the COVID-19 pandemic had a significant impact to the Indonesian citizen, and worries arose on its impact on poverty especially. For example, a joint study done by the SMERU Research Institute, Prospera, UNICEF, and UNDP between October and November 2020 on more than 12,000 households across Indonesia found that 3 out of 4 households saw reduced income, and half of those who switch job moved to the informal sector. 9 out of 10 family businesses were negatively impacted by the pandemic, and these food families had a greater risk of food insecurity. Additionally, about 13% households with children face difficulties assessing regular immunization. The pandemic's impact extended beyond the poor and shows how vulnerable a large share of our population is. Many had projected that poverty will reach as much as 12.8%, up from 9.2% prior to the pandemic. This is additional between 7 to 9 million new poor, including Asian Development Bank, my own organization SMERU, and also the World Bank. So that was the prediction early made. But despite this relatively or very severe projection, the Indonesian government managed to limit poverty rate increases. Indeed, poverty increased, but not as much as what early prediction, increased by less than 1 percentage point. Many, including the SMERU Research Institute, attributed this to the Indonesian social protection system, mobilization to disperse social assistance. Indeed, that when the pandemic hit, the government was able to increase the value and the coverage of the existing programs and beyond to reach everyone in the TTKS. This is a unified database for social protection. The government increased budget almost double from 0.8% of GDP, around 134 trillion, to about 250 trillion, around 1.6%, because the government were allowed by the parliament to increase the deficit from 3% to 5% to our GDP. So to some extent, Indonesia had an adaptive social protection system and the ability to introduce some flexibility and scalability to its many social programs. However, these efforts remain ad hoc with little legal basis that is need to respond to future crises. And in addition to this, many vulnerable people and those living in poverty were missed out during the pandemic. For example, according to Susuna's September 2020, we found that close to half of those in the bottom 10% actually did not receive any of the social protection program. Partly because our database for social protection, or DTKS, is out of date. Major update was done in 2015. So it's about 7 years obsolete. So what have we learned here? So I borrow this World Bank graph that I like it very much. On this graph, the horizontal line is the population ranked by welfare status from the bottom 10% to the top 10%, and the horizontal line is the benefit amount. What we need are two things. First, we need a regular safety net on those who are currently poor or near poor to lift up people out of poverty. This is the depth of the social protection. This is a vertical integration. This is critically important as the benefit of some of the social protection program fail to fill the gap between the household expenditure and the poverty line. For example, if a poor household only receive one program, let's say food security, kartu sembako, they only cover around 20–25% of their expenditure. So we need additional around 375,000 per household to keep their consumption at the same level as before the COVID-19. This is what I call a safety net. And the second one, what we need is the breadth, the horizontal expansion. So the up vertical is the depth, the horizontal is the breadth. We need the so-called safety rope. This is to protect those who are vulnerable from falling into poverty. This is horizontal expansion to include those in the middle class as crises are regular. The first speaker talked about, crises come and go. Even before we have finished with the COVID, we have a war now and it has impacted many people around the world. Next slide. The COVID-19 was a wake-up call, highlighting the importance of tackling the existing problem. I believe this is not only Indonesian system, but also all over the world. As we all know that the crises come and go, and at least we identified 4, but I didn't put the last one here. The first is that we need to establish the so-called social registry. This is an information system that supports intake, registration, and determination of potential eligibility for one or more social program. This includes on-demand application, active search, also to reach out those who are very vulnerable, like women, children, elderly, and disabled. So building social registry is not only about technicality. I think we know how to do it well, but this is also the issue of political economy, because it's involved many line ministries that need to work together. So I think we need this collaboration and also leadership across line ministry. The second one that we need to also bear in mind is we need to expand our social protection. For this, government needs to broaden the citizen enrollment and contribution of social protection scheme. So this is what I call the safety rope, the metaphor of safety rope to protect people from falling into poverty. Not only those in the bottom 40%, but even more when the shock comes. And lastly, we also need to do a structural reform. While the contributory social insurance is over-regulated, there is lack of regulation for the non-contributory social assistance scheme. So we need to streamline regulation as a basis for cross-ministry collaboration to integrate various programs across the government for better efficiency and also efficacy as to tackling poverty and also social welfare. Here we also need to clarify funding structure of different programs as well as the sustainability. The fiscal issue need also to be dealt very, very seriously. And lastly, we also need to involve with the locals, not only the local government, but also local actors, NGOs who have been working on the social protection issues, because they know well about who should be helped and what kind of assistance that need to be delivered, so that there is a bottom-up as well as a top-down approach, so that the program will be complete to fulfill the future social protection package. Thank you, Vailan.
Thank you, Mas Darno. So for the last speaker in the session is Baisuk Ali. So please, Baisuk, your turn is now.
Thank you for having me. I have some slides, so let's start. So because I have a limited time, so I briefly explain what I want to share with you. First, Korea is quite successful in the control the COVID-19 until the last year. But and second, from now we try to change the policy direction from the controlling the COVID-19 to the adapting the COVID-19. So kind of the with Corona policy. So and then we try to set up some kind of the rule-based supporting system rather than the ad hoc or the discrete supporting system. And third, after 2 or 3 years, we think we can recover from the pandemic. Then we go back to the previous policy challenge. So we need to try to consider a comprehensive structural reform to handle our demographic change and other changes. So let's start. Next slide, please. So we are quite successful in the controlling the COVID-19 until the 2021. So by the end of the 2021, number of new confirmed cases was less than 5,000. So that is the 1 per 10,000 population. So we have many tests taken, but the positive rate is below the 2%. So we are quite successful. So we have quite strong social distance policy, and then we suppress the spread of the COVID-19. Next slide. But surprisingly, from this year, we have quite a high number of new confirmed cases. So number of cases soared to the 400,000, about 80 times higher than the before. From the mid-March, actually we have a declining trend, but still we have, yesterday we have 100,000 new cases. So still 20 times higher than before. Next slide. because we relaxing the some kind of the social distancing policy, because we are considering cost and the benefit of the policy, as well as we have quite high vaccination rate. So by the end of the 2021, last year, 82% of the population has completely vaccinated, and booster shot, the third booster shot was given to up to the 64%. So we have quite high vaccination rate. Next please. And on top of that, we realized the average fatality rate is below 0.2%, so about the 0.13% for men and women. But the problem is that we have quite high fatality rate for the elderly aged 80 and over. So fatality rate is 2%. So total number of the deaths is about, until now, up to the about the 20,000. Of which about the 60% is the 80 and over. Next, please. Actually, previously we relaxing the social distance measure from the last October. So vaccination rate is high enough. About the half of the people have at least one vaccination, and from the October of last year, we enacted a new law. So government must compensate the operating loss if businesses are restricted or banned due to the social distancing measure to control the spread of the COVID-19. So the government now realized what the cost of the social distancing measure, the lockdown measure. So next, please. So what we have done is quite flexible fiscal expansion. So in 2020 and 2001, 4 and 2 supplementary budget are implemented respectively. So actually we checked the number of the confirmed case, and if we have increased the confirmed case, then we strengthen the social distance measure, and then we provide the social supporting to mitigating that kind of the social distancing regulation. Next, please. And we have quite several policy experiments. So April of the 2020, we gave universal cash transfer for all citizens, but we realized it is ineffective. So we have more targeted cash transfer for the special employment type workers and the self-employed and small business owner from the June of the 2020. And still we have some kind of the blind spot. So last October we have a semi-universal cash transfer. So we have cash transfer to the all citizens except the top 10%. And from the last year, we enact the Act on the protection and the support of the small business, and it enforced from the October last year. So compensation is calculated proportional to the average loss compared to the profit of the sales of the 2019, and number of the days to implement the quarantine measure, and some kind of correctional rate. 80% of the loss is compensated. On top of that, we have various local government level universal and targeted cash transfer, and we extend the unemployment and other support. Next, please. And what have done is we are quite successful. So disposable income improved in terms of level and inequality. Although the market income is deteriorate, the decline in the market income in low country is quite huge, but the poverty rate and the inequality indices improved by expanding the targeted transfer. Next, please. So what we are doing, so we have 4 things. So we still maintaining the support for the unprivileged to respond to the unequal recovery. And second, we reorganize the unemployment support policy. So we increase the coverage of the employment insurance. For now, about half people are unsubscribed, And we try to increasing the amount of the earned income tax credit, and we try to shorten the payment interval. And on top of that, we try to introduce or strengthen the non-contributory public assistance for the unemployment, for the self-employed, and special working type workers. Next, please. And we also try to expand the cash transfer to handle the demographic changes. So we try to introduce the parental allowance to boost the fertility rate. And we try to increase the wage for the youth doing the compulsory military service. And we try to increase in the non-contributing basic income benefit amount. And finally, we try to consider the financial consolidation. So we try to enforce the expenditure restructuring. So we try to introduce the fiscal rules, and we try to reorganize the roles and the resources of the central and local government to make the policy more effective. Next, please. So what we will do, so maybe after 2 or 3 years, we fully recovered the pandemic problem. So we try to come back to the previous situation. So we try to do the comprehensive structural reform in response to the demographic change. Actually, we have many things to do, and we have limited time. So next, please. So summary. So what we did is we are well in the COVID-19 control. Now we adapt to the COVID-19. And the next, we try to make the more sustainable and resilient the system to respond to the environment change, including the demographic change and technology change. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Taisuk. So I think now we're ready to move to the discussion, and we have some question already in the Q&A panel. So let me read the question for the speakers. First question for Paula. Have you found any common thread among countries that have been able to respond relatively better to the pandemic in the realm of the social protection, like a better institutional capacity, efficient resource allocation, harnessing digital transformation, adaptive evidence-based approach, as opposed to the regimented approach, etc. So in the long term, what can low and middle income countries do to evolve sustainable economic solutions given the dwindling fiscal space and increasing debt stress? The second question for Amir and also for Paula. Migrants are also part of the vulnerable groups. More so, irregular migrant experience more vulnerability and anxiety during contingency. How can we provide social protection to irregular migrants in times of contingency like the COVID-19 pandemics? Because they are irregular or illegal, the receiving countries does not usually provide protection, and the sending countries is blind on the whereabouts of their people, and those find difficulty in providing protection. The third question for Amir and John. What are the ramifications of the regional comprehensive economic protection partnership and trade liberalization on social and environmental protection, enforcement of worker rights, and etc.? I'd like also to add perhaps one question for Pak Darno. Given the geographic and demographic factors of Indonesia, what would be specific and most urgent proposal needed to be taken for inclusive social protection system for the country? And for Taisuk, for demographic transition perspective, Korea has also become an aged society. So are you able to share a recent development of the Korea pension schemes with all of us here? So since we are a bit running out of time, so I'd like perhaps each of you to spend like 2 minutes to respond for this question. Start with Paula, perhaps.
Thank you. Yeah, I will start with the second question about irregular and illegal migrants. So that was actually something that many countries addressed, and And again, obviously depending on the political situation in many countries, but in reality, the big problem and the big issues that was experienced during the pandemic was to actually identify people who needed help. So there were, again, it was difficult to provide assistance on a regular basis and in a systemic way, but there were a lot of support through, let's call it an informal network. And that is because of the nature of irregular immigration. So basically, lots of these people are not registered, and therefore it's difficult to identify them and provide good and sustainable and sustained support. That means that, again, the immigrants, and in particular the most vulnerable in this group, are those who actually experience really harsh conditions during the pandemic and normally during any kind of shock. And so we need to think a way to include them and to find a way to, and again, possibly digitalization here could come in hand to identify, to really have a sense who needs a help. But I go back to the first question, which is that I would take it from a broader view and in terms of fiscal policies that are needed to support social securities and support for the vulnerable. And obviously there are, as I said, there are short-term interventions, which are basically provided the safety net at the time of a crisis. And that's what we've seen in practice. Obviously the downsides of that, obviously that provides help and support, but the downsides of that is the problem, the depletion of resources, financial resources, and for longer term intervention. So that is exactly the critical point. So the intervention now means that we need to think how we can sustain this intervention. I was taken very much by John's point about long-term inequalities, the fact that inequality transmit from one generation to the other. So unless you really provide and you really think of systems that are for the long term, and so resilient and inclusive, but not just as a response to a crisis, but for something that is sustainable. And that really needs a much deeper intervention. And as I said before, the starting point of rethinking fiscal policies is to calculate and measure in a sort of dynamic way using many different variables, the fiscal space available to a country, and then create funds and programs to help those who cannot, they don't have the resources to invest in long-term safety nets and resilience.
Thank you, Paula. Since John has to leave soon, so I'd like to give the second opportunity to John. Please, John.
So I was asked about Indonesia's trade relationships and the impact that they might have on social protection. I guess what I'd say is that any trade deal, any trade relationship that improves the opportunities for increased productivity and growth are going to generate the resources that a country like Indonesia will need in order to implement social protection policies. It's going to be impossible to do that unless the country is growing. And these kinds of policies are in place to facilitate that growth. So I guess that would be my reaction to that question. I'm sorry that I have to leave. I hadn't quite realized that this was going on so late. In Australia, it's 7 o'clock or just coming up to 7. So I'm going to have to leave you now, but it's been a very interesting seminar. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you very much, John.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Amir, you're...
Yeah, thank you. I'll just maybe tackle one of the questions that I received on extending social protection to irregular migrant workers. I think, this is going to be a critical issue moving forward, particularly given some of the disruptions and displacement induced by climate change, natural disasters, and conflict. And so We have more examples from developed countries as opposed to developing countries that have extended social protection and social security benefits to migrant workers. In France, for example, migrant workers in an irregular situation who have been living in France for at least 3 months without interruption and whose financial resources are below a certain threshold may be eligible for state medical assistance, covering up to 100% of their healthcare expenses. In Switzerland, migrant workers in irregular situations may also, under certain conditions, enjoy various social security benefits, and coverage is not contingent on legal status, but it arises from the obligation to enroll in a social insurance scheme. And so we have more examples from some of the developed countries, but I think from developing countries in our region, we need to be thinking about building a knowledge base for migrant workers, understanding the extent, scale of migrant workers, particularly to understand how social security can be extended to them. We do not have enough information and social registries containing information about informal workers or migrant workers. Most of these are means tested. They usually cover only those living below a certain poverty threshold, and they're restricted to nationals of the country. So we do not have enough information there, but I think there's opportunities to integrate social services and benefits deliveries to migrant workers, particularly in situations related to employment and social protection rights and obligations. But some of these require agreements at the national, bilateral, and regional level. And so there are political considerations, but I think that more can be done, and this is going to become an increasingly important issue as we experience more and more conflicts and displacement. Thanks.
Thank you, Amir. Mas Darno, before you respond to the question that I read before, there's one additional question in the Q&A panel from Martina. Social registry are often criticized because they are static and do not take into account the income dynamics of the population, often moving in and out of poverty, even exacerbated by COVID-19, which has clearly shown the limitation of social registries in many countries as well as other COVID shocks. Are there any approaches for dynamic updating of the social registry? Also, DTKS already being tested or implemented in Indonesia. What are the challenges Indonesia is facing in this regard, and how could existing bottlenecks be overcome? Please, Mas Darno.
Thank you, Pak Elan. Two good, excellent questions. I'll respond to the second one on the social registry and the important dynamic updating. I think that's characterized correctly in terms of the difficulty. But what we have suggested is not only one shot social registry, but we also allow for the dynamic updating. Actually, the DTKS, at least, in theory, they already have this dynamic updating every month. They already allow people to register themselves. But the problem is in terms of the getting the clear indicators so that we can identify correctly that they are actually belong to a certain group, because we don't have a welfare ranking. Has there been any example of this? Yes, actually, Bu Vivi can also tell us. She already working in the past with the several programs on this one, and we, Pailan, also understood about this one. Actually, we also have some pilot by allowing local to register themselves. It's so-called the MPM, the on-demand application. But the challenge is how can we build this institution so they have a regular updating that can be fit into the national level data social registry. So the idea is in the future, we not only have this static updating to social registry, but we also have this active search and also with the on-demand application. I think that's my quick response. The first one is about another good question is that Indonesia is a very huge country, 8,000 islands. So when you deliver 50 million households during the COVID, it's a very challenge. But the good thing, Indonesia is also very decentralized, so we can work with the local. And that's also the very reason when we build this unified database, we also have a modeling that is also capture the localities. So we have the so-called horizontal equity Actually, the poor in Jakarta definitely different with the poor in other part of Indonesia. So that we have the equal welfare ranking that we can use to target the beneficiaries. So basically, we take into account about these differences of these localities, because Indonesia is a very heterogeneous country. So when we do either machine learning or modeling or big data, we always take into account about differences in these localities. Thank you.
Thank you, Mas Dano. Let's look your brief response to the question, please.
Yeah, thank you for my time to answer the questions. For the social registry, so actually Korea has well-developed registry system, but still we have a problem. We have several blind spots. So nowadays we try to introduce some kind of incentive system to make the people self-reporting their situation. Actually, people think the reporting my information is quite harmful because it can be increasing my tax burden, but it can increasing the benefit amount. So it's well balanced. The incentive system is key to make some kind of reduce the blind spot of the information system. And I did not have enough time to introduce my the future policy direction, but the question is raised on the pension. So I briefly explained what's current situation. So actually, the Korea is now quite young country. We have a quite horrible future expectation, but currently we are quite young country, so we are affordable to increase raising some pension amount. So we have high elderly poverty rate. So we try to increase the basic pension amount. So currently we give about the 300 USD per month for people who are aged over the 65. But now we try to increase to the 400 USD. So actually, about the 30% increase. So it can reduce the poverty rate, but it can be the burden for the fiscal burden. So gradually we try to reduce the basic pension amount and try to increase the weight on the national pension system. But the problem is the national pension system currently we have problem for the sustainability. So our payment is quite low, but the benefit level is high. So we try to raise the contribution rate as well as try to increase the participation length. So we have quite a low benefit level because we have limited length of the contribution. So if we contribute the national pension for 40 years, then the amount is sufficient. But for now, we just contribute about the 20 years. So actually, the amount of the national pension is limited. So we try to increase the contribution rate as well as the lengthen the contribution period. So actually, it's quite hard, but we try to increase some kind of the subsidy as well as regulation. So we have some kind of matching contribution from the general tax burden, as well as we try to increasing the regulation using the revenue international revenue system. So yeah, that's kind
Thank you.
so we can try. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So I'm afraid we have to wrap up the session. That perhaps some additional question. And please, for all speakers to check perhaps the Q&A if there's like a remaining question, and you can write down your response or email the question from to the questioners. I hope all that we discussed, these important topics will contribute to the thought, to the recommendation for the G20, particularly on these topics. And again, I thank you, appreciate, and then thank all the speakers for all your insight and contribution to the refining of this topic. And I think without with this, I'd like to close the session, and I return the session to the Pichaya. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Pak Ilan, and also thank you all the distinguished panelists for the in the discussion panel. Now we just moving to the last section of this webinar, which is the closing section. I would like just to invite Dr. Asep Suryahadi, who is the lead co-chair of the Task Force 5 of the T20 this year, which focus on the topic of inequality, human capital, and well-being. Pak Asep, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Pichaya. Now we have come to the end of this webinar on rethinking social protection reform in the post-pandemic recovery. I'm sure we all agree that we have had a very productive and very useful discussion today. Before closing, I would like to summarize the most important points from our discussions. I think the most important problem or challenge that we discussed today is basically how to design comprehensive, inclusive, and resilient social protection system post-COVID-19 pandemic that addresses the key challenges facing developed and developing countries, including disability, longevity, poverty, gender equality, and also non-traditional workers. Related to these points, I think there are four important points from our discussion that's worth mentioning. Yeah. First, that actually prior to COVID-19 pandemic, some challenges related to social protection system across the world already exist, such as low social protection coverage, low social protection expenditure, as well as high fragmentation and underdeveloped system. Secondly, COVID-19 is a kind of a wake-up call, as it has increased awareness and demand for shock-responsive social protection, as well as putting greater emphasis for government to strengthen and better integrate social protection delivery systems. Third, shock-responsive social protection system can be translated into inclusive and resilient social protection system, which ensure universal coverage of all types of employment, as well as ensure adequate benefit and services which respond to people's needs. And finally, the last point, inevitably, the comprehensiveness of social protection system requires it requires a credible financial commitment. In addition to that, a capacity of institutions responsible to deliver social protection system, including the human and digital capacity, should be reinforced and regularly updated to be able to deliver high-impact social programs. Those are, I think, the most important points that I gathered from our discussion today. I hope this point can serve as a guide in social protection reforms across the world in the post-pandemic era. Finally, I would like to thank ADBI, in particular Dean Tetsushi Sonobe, for the collaboration in holding this webinar, the esteemed speakers and moderators that have delivered presentation and discussion of important dimensions and aspects of social protection reforms, and of course, all of the participants for your active and productive participation. And last but not least, my colleagues at SMERU and ADBI for their hard work, which has made this webinar possible and run smoothly. Thank you. Please join us in appreciating our speakers and moderators. Now I return the floor to Pichaya. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pak Asep. And before we finish this webinar, I would like just to kindly ask all the speaker and panelists to turn on your camera one more time for our group's photo. Just, okay. Pak Dano, are you still with us?
Yes, I am.
Okay. So Dean Sonobe, are you still with us? All right. Let's just on mic help, please. We just go ahead. So 1, 2, 3, smile. And one more time, please. 1, 2, 3, smile. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for your kind and active participation. I'd like just to echo ourselves again to thank all the speakers and the distinguished panelists to join our webinar today. And don't forget just to follow us and also attend the next T20 site event, but co-organized by ADBI and also SMERU Research Institute next month too. And with no further ado, I just like to close this webinar, and I'd like to ask all the participants to answer this satisfactory survey after this event too, so that we know what would you like us to do and to improve for the next event. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a lovely day ahead.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Bichaya. Thank you, Pak Elan.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.